Inside a grass dome in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, the temperature is 30 degrees cooler than the air outside. No electricity, no insulation panels, no modern materials of any kind, just dried grass, bent wood, and 800 years of engineering knowledge that most of the world has never heard of. Think about the last time you tried to sleep in a tent on a hot summer night. The fabric walls trapping every degree of heat, the air turning thick and stale. That suffocating feeling that no amount of ventilation seemed to fix. You were inside a product that cost hundreds of dollars, designed with modern materials, and it failed you in the most basic way possible. The Apache people solved that exact problem centuries ago, using nothing but what the desert gave them. And their solution outperforms your tent in every measurable way. Welcome to Primal Echoes. This channel exists for one reason. Because the most advanced survival technology humanity ever built wasn't invented in a laboratory. It was shaped by generations of people who had no choice but to get it exactly right. In this video, 3 questions are going to stay with you from this moment until the very end. How did a structure made of grass stay cool enough to sleep in at midday? Why does modern architecture still fail to replicate it? And what does that say about the way we think about progress? By the time this video is over, you will never look at a tent the same way again. But before a single branch was cut, before a single bundle of grass was gathered, they did something that modern architects still rarely do. They listened, not to a client brief or a building code, but to the land itself. And the land, if you know how to read it, tells you everything you need to know. Experienced builders would walk the terrain for days before choosing a site. They read the desert the way you read a page, looking for clues written in the shapes of dried shrubs, the way sand had piled against rocks, the subtle lean of brittle branches. Each of those signs was a record of the wind, a map of invisible air currents that moved through the canyon every single day. A small ridge, the edge of a plateau, the shoulder of a hill, these were the ideal locations. Places where air was always in motion, never settling, never stagnating. Low valleys and deep ravines were avoided entirely. In still, sunken air, heat doesn't move. It accumulates. And in a desert, accumulated heat is a slow death. Once the site was chosen, they turned their attention downward. The surface layer of hot dust and loose stone was cleared away, and the floor of the future dwelling was dug several inches deeper than ground level, reaching the cooler, denser earth below. That cooler soil wasn't just more comfortable to lie on. It was a thermal resource. And here is where the real engineering begins. Because the floor wasn't just a floor. It was a battery. Dry clay harvested from the beds of ancient evaporated lakes was crushed, mixed with water, and packed down by hand and foot into a dense, smooth surface. That clay absorbed the cool night air every single evening and held it, slowly releasing it back into the living space throughout the burning hours of the following day. The earth was their refrigerator. Charged every night, used all day. Modern passive architecture calls this thermal mass, and it is now considered one of the most effective tools in sustainable building design. The Apache people didn't have a name for it. They didn't need one. They had something more powerful than a term. They had generations of direct experience proving that it worked. And the deeper philosophical truth underneath all of this is something that no engineering school teaches directly. They were not building on the earth. They were building with it. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. One approach treats the land as a surface to be used. The other treats it as a partner to be understood. Remember the 3 questions I asked at the beginning of this video? We are getting closer to the first answer. But to understand how this structure stayed cool enough to sleep in at midday, we need to talk about the part that made modern researchers genuinely pause when they first studied it. The shell itself, and the invisible physics happening inside every single layer. Now here is the part that made modern engineers genuinely uncomfortable when they first studied it. Not because it was strange, because it was obvious. Because once you understand how this shell was built, and why it worked, the question that follows is deeply unsettling. Why did it take us this long to figure it out? The outer covering of the Wickiup was built from long, stiff leaves of desert yucca, layered over bundles of dried grass and woven branches. The material was laid from the bottom upward, like roof tiles, each layer overlapping the one below it, and the color mattered enormously. The pale, sun-bleached tone of dried desert grass was not an aesthetic choice. It was a weapon. Dark surfaces absorb solar radiation and convert it directly into heat. Light surfaces reflect it back into the sky. That pale outer layer acted as a giant optical mirror, bouncing the sun's thermal energy away from the structure before it ever had the chance to penetrate inward. Here is where it becomes remarkable. NASA engineers apply this exact same reflective principle to spacecraft heat shields, surfaces designed to deflect the catastrophic thermal energy of atmospheric re-entry. Apache builders understood and applied this principle 800 years before the first rocket ever left the ground. Let that sit for a moment, but reflection alone was not enough. The shell was not a solid, sealed wall. It was a breathing membrane. Thousands of microscopic channels existed between the individual grass stalks, invisible to the eye, but critical to the system. As hot outside air moved through these natural filters, it slowed, scattered, and lost a portion of its thermal force before ever reaching the interior. The covering was dense enough to block direct heat, but porous enough to allow a filtered exchange of air to continue at all times. And the dome shape itself was not chosen for aesthetic reasons either. It was chosen for physics. Wind moves faster over a curved surface than over flat ground. When air accelerates across the top of the dome, it creates a zone of reduced pressure directly above the upper ventilation opening at the peak of the structure. That low-pressure zone acts like an invisible pump, drawing hot air upward and out of the interior continuously. At the same time, small ventilation gaps positioned at ground level allowed cooler air to enter from below. The ratio between the lower intake area and the upper exhaust opening was carefully maintained. Too much of one, too little of the other, and the entire airflow system stalled. The builders understood this balance intuitively, and they got it right every time. This is the Bernoulli effect, a principle that modern fluid dynamics textbooks describe in precise mathematical terms. The Apache had no equations. They had something better. They had built this structure enough times to feel when the airflow was right, and they had adjusted until it was perfect. Inside, the result was not a draft. It was a breeze. Cool air entered low, spread gently across the clay floor, warmed gradually from the body heat of the people resting there, and rose slowly toward the peak to exit. The movement was continuous, silent, and effortless. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself inside it. The desert outside is sitting at 110 degrees. The sun is directly overhead, and the rocks outside are hot enough to blister skin on contact. But you are lying on cool packed clay, and a soft, steady movement of air is crossing your body like a whisper. No hum of a machine, no electrical cord, no monthly energy bill, just the shape of a dome, the porosity of dried grass, and the immovable laws of physics, doing exactly what they have always done. When thermal imaging cameras were pointed at a traditional grass dome and a modern nylon tent side by side in desert conditions, the difference was not subtle. The tent glowed in the thermal image, a concentrated mass of trapped, radiating heat, its sealed synthetic walls turning solar energy into an oven. The dome appeared as a cool, diffused shape, its reflective surface dissipating energy evenly in every direction rather than concentrating it inward. The tent was a greenhouse. The dome was a lung. This brings us back to the second question from the beginning of this video: why modern architecture still struggles to replicate it? And the answer is beginning to take shape. A tent is designed to keep the outside out. The dome was designed to work with the outside, to use its forces rather than resist them. That fundamental difference in philosophy is the reason no synthetic material has yet closed the gap. But the shell, as extraordinary as it was only half of the system. The other half was alive. It responded, adjusted, and adapted, not once, but every single hour of every single day. And that is what we are going to look at next. The structure was smart, but the people inside were smarter. Because a passive system, no matter how well designed, is still a fixed object. What made this dwelling truly extraordinary was the human layer, the constant, attentive interaction between the people living inside it and the environment pressing against its walls from every direction. Each part of the day had its own protocol. In the early morning, when the desert stones still held the coolness of the night, the lower ventilation gaps were opened wide. Fresh cold air flooded through the interior, and the clay floor absorbed it like a sponge. This was the charging cycle, storing as much thermal reserve as possible before the sun climbed high enough to begin its assault. As midday approached and the heat outside became severe, the vents were partially closed, slowing the exchange and protecting the cool interior from the scorching air outside. By late afternoon, as the sun began its descent and the air temperature started to ease, the gaps were opened again, allowing a fresh evening circulation to flush out the accumulated warmth of the day. At night, the system reversed entirely, retaining the heat of smoldering coals inside while the desert temperature dropped, sometimes dramatically, toward freezing. The same structure that cooled in the day heated at night, not because it was reconfigured, but because the people inside understood its rhythms and worked with them. When sandstorms struck, and in the desert, they struck without warning, the dome transformed. Every gap was plugged with packed grass, the entrance sealed with heavy hide, and the structure became an airtight capsule. The rounded, hemispherical shape offered no flat surface for the wind to push against. Gale force gusts swept over and around it, while the people inside sat in complete stillness, hearing only the howl of the storm against the outer shell. And then there is something that almost no one talks about when they study these structures, something that stops researchers cold the first time they encounter it. The dome was not just a thermal system, it was an acoustic one. The curved interior walls and the interwoven layers of branch and grass created a natural resonance chamber, a shape that gathered and concentrated sound from the surrounding environment. Low-frequency vibrations from the ground, the kind produced by approaching footsteps, by the movement of animals, by anything heavy moving across the desert floor at a distance, passed through the walls and were amplified inside. The people resting within could feel, and sometimes hear, movement from a considerable distance before it was visible. The dwelling functioned as an early warning system, built directly into its own architecture, and when rain came, those same grass-covered walls transformed the sound of falling water into something almost musical, a soft, layered rustling that bore no resemblance to the sharp drumming of rain on synthetic fabric. It was, by every account of those who have studied it, a sound that invited sleep. Nature composing a lullaby through the instrument of the house itself. They didn't just build shelters, they built extensions of their own nervous system. The structure saw for them, heard for them, breathed for them, and held warmth or coolness on their behalf. Today, the global tiny house movement and the passive building industry are spending billions of dollars trying to recreate, through technology and design software, something that these builders achieved through observation, patience, and an intimate relationship with the physical world. The gap between what they had and what we are still reaching for is not a gap in materials, it is a gap in philosophy. Now you understand the answer to the third question from the beginning of this video. Why does modern architecture still struggle to replicate it? Because replication requires more than copying a shape or sourcing a similar material. It requires adopting an entirely different way of thinking about what a building is. Not a barrier between people and nature, but a bridge between them. The Wickiup was never finished in the way we think of a finished building. It was alive. It was always being adjusted, repaired, observed, and responded to. And that aliveness was the technology. That is what no factory has yet manufactured, and no blueprint has yet captured. For generations, academic textbooks referred to structures like this as primitive huts. Simple, rudimentary, the dwellings of people who had not yet advanced. That word, primitive, says far more about the limitations of the textbooks than it ever said about the structures themselves. What we have spent this entire video examining is not primitive, it is precise. It is a system of interlocking physical principles: thermal mass, optical reflection, fluid dynamics, acoustic resonance, passive convection, working together without a single moving part, without a single watt of power, and without a single component that cannot be sourced within walking distance of where it stands. If that is primitive, then we need a new word for what modern construction is still trying to become. Today, disaster relief organizations are studying dome-shaped breathable shelters for deployment in extreme heat environments. Passive building architects are embedding thermal mass floors into high-end sustainable homes. Emergency response engineers are redesigning field tents around the principle of porous, layered airflow rather than sealed synthetic barriers. The knowledge didn't disappear, it waited. It waited in the canyons and the dry riverbeds and the memories of the people who carried it forward, until the rest of the world was finally ready to listen. Here is the answer to the first question, the one that opened this video. How did a structure made of grass stay cool enough to sleep in at midday? It did it because every single decision, the site, the depth of the floor, the color of the grass, the angle of the dome, the ratio of the vents, was made in service of one unified goal, not to fight the desert, but to think like it. That is not a construction technique, that is a philosophy. And it is one that took the modern world 8 centuries to begin to rediscover. This is Primal Echoes. We exist to recover the engineering intelligence that history forgot to preserve. The knowledge built not in laboratories but in the harshest places on Earth, by people who had no margin for error and no option but to get it right. If this video changed the way you think about shelter, about nature, about what intelligence actually looks like, subscribe and stay with us, because what comes next goes even further into the cold. In our next episode, we are going inside the winter world of the Athabascan people of the subarctic. Builders who engineered survival at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, without steel, without synthetic insulation, and without a single source of heat, beyond what the earth and their own ingenuity could provide. The desert was one kind of extreme. What they faced was another kind entirely. And the solutions they found will challenge everything you think you know about cold, warmth, and the limits of human endurance.